Rules Update 2023. Each year, we carry out a review of some part of the game, looking to see what we can improve. This report summarises and explains the changes so that players can identify and understand the changes easily. We try to include a section after each update to explain the reasoning behind each change, as well as providing an in-character rationale for what has changed where appropriate. Military rituals. We've made changes to some existing rituals that have an impact on the military campaign. We've changed the effects produced by 2 rituals for enchanting campaign armies. These are Knights of Glory and Bound by Common Cause. We've also increased the magnitude of 4 rituals used summoning magical fortifications, which are the Frozen Citadel of Cathan Kene, Forge the Wooden Fastness, Dripping Echoes of the Fen, and the Basalt Citadel. We hope that these changes will ensure a good balance of options available to ritualists involved with the Empire's military campaigns going forwards, but we will continue to monitor the situation carefully. Reasoning for the Knights of Glory change. Knights of Glory was a much better ritual than any equivalent ritual in Imperial lore. The benefits it provided were significantly better than those provided by the equivalent rituals. While some realms will always be better at creating certain magical effects, in this area of the game, we want there to be a lot of viable options to choose between. To remedy this, we've reduced the potency of Knights of Glory from 3,000 additional strength to 2,000 additional strength to bring it in line with the other rituals. It has a higher magnitude than a ritual like Clarity of the Master Strategist because the additional strength gained inflicts more casualties. We've also added a few details, a role-playing effect, and a new option for players to target multiple generals in one ritual. We also made it explicit that it might have unpredictable effects on characters whose military units support the army, something we'd done via Winds of War in previous seasons. Finally, we've revealed the assurance bound into the ritual that will cause it to lose power entirely if it's broken. We'd previously been running a plot regarding the Empire's relationship with Naris, the Eternal whose patronage is responsible for the Knights of Glory. Last event, she said she was going to remove the ability to perform the ritual entirely and replace it with a new one. We knew we needed to change the ritual's power to play balance it, and we thought the easiest way to do that would be to replace it with a different ritual. Instead, we've reduced the effects of the ritual and left it available to players to cast. We took this new direction because the realities of placing a new ritual in Imperial lore via the Conclave felt too punished, especially under the new rules about how a declaration works. The reasoning for Bound by Common Cause. The ritual now provides additional strength solely for the purpose of taking or holding a territory rather than a flat bonus as it did previously. This change makes the effects comparable with Clarity of the Master Strategist. We've made it possible to cast the ritual on multiple generals at once at reduced magnitude, as we did with the Knights of Glory. The permanent enchantment on the Wolves of War will provide the same benefits as the new version of the ritual. Reasoning for changing the Citadel's rituals. We've increased the magnitude of 3 Citadel summoning rituals, the Frozen Citadel of Cathan Kene, Forge the Wooden Fastness, and Dripping Echoes of the Fen, from 80 to 100. These rituals produce very powerful effects that can have a dramatic impact on a military campaign, so they need to have a cost that reflects that impact. We've also changed the magnitude of Golden Ramparts and Stone's Unyielding Defiance, rituals that provide additional strength to fortifications, bringing them into line with these changes. In-character explanation. In each case, the explanation for the changes is the esoteric conjunction of the key and the lock that's been going on for some time. With the Knights of Glory, we've assumed that the representatives of the Empire have continued to flatter and charm Narrated, causing her to change her mind regarding her ritual. The ritual's changed because of the conjunction, but the Eternal's now happy for the Empire to perform it, at least for the time being. The Lion of Summer will always be a volatile figure who's quick to anger, and she won't hesitate to express her anger at the Empire in the future if she does feel slighted. Military units and fleets. We've changed the conquered territory limit so that it also applies to fleets and military units. Previously, they weren't affected by the conquered territory penalty, but now they suffer the penalty just like any other resource. Reasoning. The existing rules provided these 2 resources with a small advantage that is simply not warranted from a play balance point of view. Initially, we'd erred on the side of simulation, imagining that because military units and fleets were mobile, the penalty ought not to apply to them. But as the game progressed, this exception has become increasingly jarring. It's never been possible to move a fleet or a military unit from one territory to the next, so it was a mistake to treat them differently for other purposes. I see explanation. While military units and fleets are inherently mobile, the people in them have families who aren't. If your military unit or fleet is based in a territory, it represents the fact that the individual soldiers or sailors who work for you have families and lives there. A fleet or a military unit has a home base that exists in a territory, and if that territory is conquered, the people who operate the resource will be less productive. This is why you simply can't move a military unit to another territory, and why they're now also affected by the penalty for being in a conquered territory. Conduct. Disability. We've added a new section to our conduct rules to make it clear that you must not question another player's right to use aids and adaptations put in place for disabled participants. This is particularly important in the light of the new rules that have been put in place for vehicle access at the events. The provisions that we've put in place are there for those who find that they need them on a self-declared basis. If you are absolutely certain that someone is repeatedly using a facility or service they openly admit that they don't have a need for, to the direct detriment of disabled participants, then you may report the matter to Profound Decisions to deal with. Challenging other participants or publicly complaining about their behaviour is not acceptable under any circumstances. Smut. Recently, we've had an upsurge of interest and promotion of sexual publications in Empire, with a range of stuff from the simply smutty to the more explicit. There's always been a fair bit of it about in Empire, and in general we don't have any issue with it at all. Indeed, one of the reasons that we ran a plotline involving such publications in Empire was because we wanted to make it clear to players that the new conduct rules didn't mean that folks couldn't do that sort of thing at events anymore. However, there are two things that anyone playing in this space needs to be very careful about. The first issue is consent. A person's character belongs to them. It's an extension of their personality in some form. As such, it is absolutely not acceptable to take that character and use it in your erotic fiction without their explicit consent to what you're creating, even if that character is no longer in play. Historical figures in the game are fine. Folk are welcome to write any kind of fiction about figures from the setting who died long before the game began. But anyone who's been phys-repped, so physically represented, as a living character is not yours to write about. This includes our NPCs, our civil servants, our magistrates and egregores, as well as characters played by PCs. Our conduct rules clearly state that any attempt to sexualise other participants' characters without their permission will be treated as sexual harassment. The other thing you must be mindful of is the requirement to avoid sexualising the environment in a way that makes other players uncomfortable. Lots of players enjoy these publications, and lots of players don't want anything to do with that in their LARP. We've updated our conduct rules on sexual activity at events to make clear that anyone who wants to engage in that kind of role-playing must ensure that it's handled discreetly and in a way that doesn't force other players to be involved with it against their wishes. In particular, that means you can't promote it on our Facebook groups, since that's incompatible with the need to handle it discreetly in a way that doesn't cause discomfort for other players. We've asked the moderators to take down posts promoting material that's smutty or explicit in the future. Spring rituals. There have been some significant changes to 3 spring rituals. We've clarified Blood of the Hydra and made it clear that it only works on limbs ruined by cleave and impale effects, and we've made a change to the role-playing effects of Fan the Flame of New Life to remove the idea that enchantment makes targets horny, and we've removed the midwife's recourse ritual entirely. In the latter case, if you were the target of an ongoing midwife's recourse enchantment, its effects will end before the start of the next event. As always, if you've mastered one of the rituals that was changed, you can email admin@profouндecisions.co.uk and we'll remove the mastery, leaving you free to master a different ritual. In-character explanation. In each case, the in-character explanation for these changes is the effect of the ongoing conjunction of the key and the lock. The esoteric tension between things are hidden and things are revealed has unexpected and permanent effects on certain rituals. Reasoning. Blood of the Hydra. When it was initially created, the intention of Blood of the Hydra was that it was going to be one of a suite of low-magnitude rituals that allowed ritualists to create the effects of certain spells. The suite included rituals such as Hands of Sacred Life, that duplicates the heal spell, and the combination of Aesthetic Star of Atun and Renewed Strength of the New Day, which between them duplicate the effect of the Purify spell. Over time, though, the scope of the ritual has shifted to allow it to be used to repair any lingering damage to the body, so we've restored the ritual to its original purpose. Permanent, life-changing injuries are not a theme of our game because we don't want our game mechanics to trivialise those injuries. We never want a situation where someone with an out-of-character disability is asked in character, why don't they just use Blood of the Hydra, or any magic, to remove their disability? This is one of the reasons our existing Healing in Empire page talks about spring magic speeding up natural healing processes, rather than regenerating lost limbs or the like. Disabilities and long-lasting or permanent injuries exist in the setting, but players who are not themselves disabled should be sensitive to the experiences of others and think carefully about playing a character who has any kind of long-term disability. There are deliberately no rules to allow one character to maim another character. It's fine for a player to choose to roleplay that they've received a specific injury when they suffer damage, but unless there's a traumatic wound or similar card involved, our rules will treat that injury like any other loss of hits. You might roleplay severing your fingertip in a knife game, but our expectation is that the heal spell or attentions of a physic will allow that severed fingertip to be reattached or repaired, just as it would any other loss of hit points. And we don't want a single low-magnitude ritual to replace the physics skill. Some of the traumatic wounds we created early on in Empire imposed a need for ritual magic to deal with powerful magic effects that were devastating the body. We retired these wounds some time ago. While they were fun, they were at odds with the lower fantasy feel we want for the game. Blood of the Hydra will remain a useful tool for some traumatic wounds where the requirement to mend a cleaved limb is explicitly mentioned, but it won't be the only tool that works. Reasoning. Fan the flame of new life. The original version of this ritual had the role-playing effect of making participants, quote, vigorous and lusty, unquote. Over time, it became clear that this had too much potential to put players in uncomfortable positions. There's no place for any kind of game effect that might impact a character's capacity to consent in Empire, or to put any player under pressure to roleplay something that they're not comfortable with. As a consequence, we've completely removed the role-playing effects of this ritual. We've also removed the reference to the ritual not being powerful enough to allow conception between orcs and humans, as it's not our intention that any magic will allow conception between different in-character species. We've removed the language around women and men as well. The ritual works on any two willing characters of the same IC species. Grove Blossom exists in the setting to allow characters to transition if they choose. Matters of sexual physiology, up to including the ability to conceive, are a matter for the individual participant. As with other parts of the game that are serious and can affect participants in the real world, we require that anyone using the ritual treat the matter sensitively. We still wanted to keep the idea of a spring ritual that allows people to address questions of infertility and to give players a way to bless a union, so we've left the ritual's role as a component of marriage ceremonies in place. Reasoning. Midwife's recourse. The original purpose for this ritual was to address situations where players who were role-playing being pregnant were pressurized into avoiding skirmishes or battles. In practice, it was a mistake to address the issue with the ritual because many participants chose to roleplay that their character is pregnant because they are pregnant in real life. The ritual compounded the problems that happen when in-character and out-of-character are overlapping. We never want a situation where someone tells an out-of-character pregnant person that they should get this ritual cast on them so they can go to battles, for example. The ritual is also intended to show how the Empire has excellent pre- and antenatal care that's equivalent to that found in the modern United Kingdom, rather than the kind of medical technology that might be expected from a broadly medieval setting. Miscarriage and death in pregnancy are not themes of the game. They exist in a setting so that players who need to refer to them for real-world reasons can do so. Players who've not themselves had a miscarriage should be sensitive to the experiences of others and think very carefully about playing a character who's experienced any kind of difficulty with childbirth. Because we don't want the medical issues related to childbirth to be a theme of the game, we've removed the ritual. In Empire, a physic will treat any issues during childbirth using herbs and be successful most of the time. In character, the expectation is that nobody tells pregnant characters what they should or what they shouldn't do. We've updated the pages on technology and healing in the Empire accordingly. Out of character, our event safety rules make it clear that any player who's advised by a medical professional to avoid strenuous physical activity should not participate in fighting. This means that an out-of-character decision to participate in any part of Empire is a matter for the player based on the medical advice that they've received, and it's not a matter for other participants to comment on. Conclave changes. As Empire has grown, it's become clearer that Conclave is starting to creak under the strain. Conclave sessions have become so long that they've become a standing joke among the player base. It's also become clear that some of the mechanisms aren't providing the kind of game experience that we want to promote. With that in mind, we're making some changes to how the Imperial Conclave operates. Conclave Agenda. Declarations are raised by Grandmasters and by a handful of other titles. The agenda remains publicly available, and anyone can check and see what declarations have been raised and by whom. The first major change we're making is to the agenda itself. Each Grandmaster can raise a single declaration to the agenda each session for a total of 2 declarations each summit. They can raise these declarations themselves or pass the declaration on to a member of their order to raise and present. Certain existing titles have gained the ability to raise a single specific declaration each event, rather than each session. The existing titles and the declaration that they'll be able to raise are as follows. The Bursar of the Conclave can raise a declaration of endowment. The Imperial Censor can raise a declaration of interdiction. The Dean of the Lyceum can raise a declaration of imperial law. The Imperial Magus can raise a declaration of concord. Each Archmage can raise a declaration of alignment, which encompasses the old declarations of amity, enmity, and neutrality for an eternal of their realm. The Throne can raise a declaration of candidacy. Finally, the Arbiter of the Rogue Declaration is a special Imperial title that's auctioned for crystal mana each Saturday, and it works in a similar manner to an Imperial Wayleave. It allows the Imperial citizen who wins the auction to raise a declaration of their choice to the agenda for the Saturday evening conclave session. The mana raised becomes part of the font. As before, declarations are submitted to the Conclave Civil Servant at the hub and are displayed publicly. Declarations are added to the agenda in the order they are received. The deadline for submitting declarations remains the same. It's an hour before the session is due to begin. The Senate would be able to create new titles with the power of declaration, but no more than 1 title per type of declaration. Our intention is to limit the number of titles that can gain the declaration power so that only 1 additional declaration of each type can be raised during an event. So, using the examples above, only the Bursar of the Conclave can have the power to raise a bonus of declaration of endowment, and if the Senate wants a different title to have that power, they're going to need to remove it from the Bursar. Declarations. We've also overhauled the declarations, pinning down what they can do and, wherever possible, making them more impactful. Alignment. This declaration combines the old amity, enmity, and neutrality into a single declaration that sets the status of an Eternal in relation to the Conclave. The effects of amity and enmity have not changed. Candidacy. This has been significantly overhauled, and we've covered it in its own section below. Concord. The declaration works the same way as it did previously, but the potential impact is much greater, comparable to a statement of principle in the Imperial Synod. Dissemination is unchanged. Endorsement. This is a new declaration that allows the Conclave to declare an act of magic to be in the interests of the Empire. Endowment. The changes to the font, which is the pool of mana that Conclave controls, add significant new functionality to this declaration, ensuring there's always a pool of mana for the Conclave to distribute if they wish to do so. Imperial law remains unchanged. Interdiction. We've expanded the guidance on how this declaration works and what it explicitly does in each case. We've also combined it with a declaration of license, which removes interdiction. We've removed the idea that an item or ritual might be interdicted in a way that means the magistrate sees something and keep it. If the conclave deems something dangerous, it's destroyed. Sorcery. As with alignment, we've combined sorcery and reconciliation into a single declaration. We've also made it possible to use a single declaration to declare multiple people to be sorcerers, but on the understanding that the conclave either condemns all or none of them. Candidacy. We've made extensive changes to candidacy to make it more impactful and of greater interest. Rather than the declaration being, this person should have this title, the emphasis changes to, there should be a new person in this title. When candidacy is declared, anyone can throw their hat into the ring to claim the title. Each of them can then spend a mana to speak on their own behalf, but there's no cross-examination. Once every candidate has declared themselves and made their pitch, the conclave moves straight to the vote. Our intention is that candidacy be more impactful in that it has the potential to engage everyone in the room. Conclave session. During a session, each declaration is presented in turn. Orders have 1 minute to discuss the matter at hand among themselves, and then the formal debate begins. Grand Masters recognise speakers in order of precedence from lowest to highest. Discussion continues until all Grand Masters pass, or half the Grand Masters have moved to vote. During a conclave session, declarations are raised, discussed, and voted on by the Imperial Conclave in the order they were added to the agenda. The civil service read out the precise wording of the declaration. Then, the person who raised it can spend mana to make a presentation, to speak before the conclave on the matter at hand. The orders then have a minute to speak among themselves, and then the discussion begins. During the discussion, the civil servant calls on each Grand Master in order of precedence, starting with the largest order to contribute to the discussion. They have 3 options at this point. First, they can nominate someone to speak. This costs mana. They can choose to pass. They don't nominate someone to speak, but their order still participates in the discussion. If all of the Grand Masters pass, the discussion ends. Or they can choose to move to vote. They don't nominate someone and will not be called on again to discuss the current matter. Essentially, they indicate that their order is done with the matter and want to get to the vote. Once half the Grand Masters have moved to vote, the current round of discussion plays out so that every order has had an equal opportunity to discuss, and then a vote is called. Speaking during conclave. Speaking during conclave still costs mana, but each additional minute costs more than the preceding minute. The first minute costs 1 mana, the second minute costs 2 mana, the third 3 mana, and so on. The same cost is used whether the magician is making a presentation for a declaration or speaking during the discussion. The font. Rather than immediately distributing the font to the Grand Masters, the crystal mana in the font remains under the control of the conclave and the declaration of endowment. We've added 211 mana to the starting font for the first event of 2023. The font consists of all the mana used during a conclave session, plus that raised by auctioning the rogue declaration. Rather than being divided among the Grand Masters at the start of the next event, the font remains in the control of the conclave, subject to declaration of endowment, like any other resource the conclave controls. It functions in a similar way to the way the Imperial Treasury works in the Senate or the Virtue Fund in the Synod. A declaration of endowment allows the conclave to give any amount of it to a specific named individual. Any remaining crystal mana left in the font at the end of the event is divided among the Grand Masters as before, and received in their packs at the start of the next event. Anything left over is added to the mana raised during the event and becomes the new font. We've added 211 mana to the font for the next event as a one-off payment to cover the transition effects of this rules change. Conclave address. We've removed the conclave address as a concept. A new conclave session is added on Saturday afternoon, specifically for the Archmages to address Imperial magicians. The conclave address has been removed, with one specific exception we'll cover later. We want the conclave to be about characters coming together to make decisions, and addresses, by their nature, lack a decision point. In the past, we shied away from removing them for a number of reasons. Foremost among them was the concern that it would just lead to declarations of concord being repurposed as addresses. With the limited number of declarations each session and the added impact of Declaration of Concord, this is no longer a concern. One group of titles, however, had a special relationship with addresses, which is the Archmages. To recognise this, we're introducing the Arcane Colloquium. This is an additional conclave session specifically for the Archmages. Taking place early on Saturday afternoon, the civil service will support the Archmages in a meeting in the Hall of Worlds, during which each one in turn has 15 minutes to use as they wish, making announcements, hosting discussions, chairing a seminar, or giving space to other magicians to do the same. Conclave titles. We've made some changes to the Conclave titles. Where possible, we've made as few changes to existing Imperial titles as possible. So we've removed the free address from those titles that had it, as we mentioned previously. Those titles who had the ability to make a free declaration now have much more significant power to add to a specific declaration to the agenda each summit. Unlike the Grand Masters, this ability is very much a power of the title. Only the title holder or their proxy can present the declaration during the conclave session. The title that's seen the greatest change to their powers is the Throne. They can still nominate speakers as a Grand Master does, but we've removed the Master of Magic power because this ability was simply too disruptive given the changes we've made to the conclave. Instead, we've given them several new powers. 1. When the Throne moves to vote, it ends the discussion once the current round is complete, regardless of what the Grand Masters may have voted. This gives the Throne greater influence over the business of the conclave and partly reflects the Master of Magic power. 2. They can raise a declaration of candidacy once each summit, partially reflecting the old Master of Magic power, but reinforcing the idea of the Throne having a say in who is best suited to serve the Empire. 3. We've given them the ability to address the conclave, reflecting their power to speak in other houses and existing ability to address the Empire. And 4. We've given them the ability to influence the agenda, prioritising one declaration and moving another to the end of the agenda. Reasoning. This is quite long, so bear with me. Each of the houses of power in Empire, which are the Senate, the Synod, the Military Council, the Burse and the Conclave, work differently. Each influences different areas of the game, and each uses unique mechanisms to do so. The Imperial Conclave ultimately makes decisions about magic and allows any magician in the Empire to participate through open debate and open voting. We want to try to keep as much of this core identity intact as possible. The main challenge that we need to address is that the Conclave sessions are too long, regularly reaching 3-4 hours in length and often getting bogged down in discussions that many people in the room are not invested in. Our ideal conclave is no longer than 90 minutes and has a tight focus on the most important issues to try and get as many people invested in the matters being discussed as possible. Our initial approach was to reduce the number of people who could talk on each declaration. The fact that anyone can talk for as long as they pay mana is a key factor in the length of conclave sessions. After further discussion, however, we decided that reducing the ability of characters to argue and debate would be discarding one of the elements that makes the conclave unique, its mass participation. Instead of restricting players' ability to speak, we've opted to take the only other option that would reduce the length of sessions, cutting down the number of declarations. By doing that, we're hoping the sessions will be shorter, and if the declarations are limited in number, they're more likely to be focused on key issues that impact the game as a whole. Of course, more people will want to submit declarations than the system allows for, so players will have to fight over what declarations are submitted. We hope that Grandmasters in particular will be kept very busy, with people trying to persuade them to use one of their orders declarations to support whatever their agenda that character is pushing, and we expect there'll be a lot of politics and roleplay around this, but it's going to take place outside of Conclave, rather than during Conclave. We've also taken the decision to remove the Conclave addresses entirely from the Conclave sessions. Most addresses have always had a very specialised audience. The addresses by the Archmages in particular are often focused on Eternals and their business. When you have a part of the game that's of high interest to a small group, but low interest to everyone else, the trick is to separate it off, so that only the players who care are there for it. So that's what we've done. We've moved the Archmage addresses to their own special session, the Arcane Colloquium. It's effectively 6 special sessions, one for each realm of magic, which the Archmage can either use to address those assembled, or cede the floor to others to let them speak. While we expect there may be less people present than came to Conclave, the audience for the new colloquium will be there explicitly to hear what's being said and to take part in the discussions, so it should be much more engaged. Overhauling the way Conclave works required us to look at the roles of the orders and how the Grandmasters operate. The changes we're making also require us to look at the Archmages and many of the other titles, both those that have been in the game since the start and those that the players have created themselves. We've also taken this opportunity to look at the font, so how it's been calculated, how it's used, and what we can do to make it more integral to the functioning of the Conclave. Then there's the introduction of a brand new type of declaration called endorsement. The Conclave was always intended to be the body that regulates magic in the Empire, but without the right legal tools to do that, there's a tendency for everything to fall back to the Senate. The Imperial Senate should make laws, but the laws are enforced by our magistrates. Rituals and pacts with Eternals that are controversial, often ending up for legal interpretation with our magistrates, which means our NPCs are deciding if the players should have done the thing or not done the thing. That's the very opposite of what we want. So we've created a new declaration of endorsement to put that control very firmly back in the hands of players where it should have been all along. And finally, we've adjusted the significance of the Declaration of Concord to make it clear that the Empire's magicians are listening to what the Conclave has to say. We want to try and get some of the game the Synod generates with its use of statements of principles and mandates. Previously, there have been so many declarations, it was hard for us to focus on them individually. The Synod has a similar problem, but there we could use the requirement for a greater majority to help us focus on the most important ones. Now the number of declarations of Concord is likely to be strictly limited, we hope to respond to the most controversial of those passed with Winds of Fortune or other plot developments. In that way, we can further enhance the importance of the Conclave and what happens there. IC explanation. Any in-character explanation is always a fig leaf at best. We are exercising our position as the event organisers to use our experience to try and improve the overall game design. We do that each year because we want to keep improving Empire so that it remains the best game we can possibly deliver for our players. And we know any change is always painful and it always upsets people, but it's part of what keeps Empire fresh. In a situation like this, where we've fundamentally rewritten parts of how the game design works, it's near impossible to create an in-character explanation for the changes that fits the theme of the setting. We could claim this change is supposed to happen after an empress magically disappears or that a comet did it, but it would be patently preposterous. In the end, the only IC explanation that's even vaguely credible is that the civil service have the authority to make administrative changes to the processes of Empire to ensure it's smooth running. That's the closest to actual reality. These changes are being made by profound decisions to make the game better. And it will work every time we need to use it in the future to make changes to improve Empire. So that's what we're going with. Even if it doesn't fully fit the theme of the setting, the civil service have that kind of power. We do want to be clear that this is just an IC fig leaf for anyone who absolutely needs a way to refer to changes in character. This is a change that PD have made. It's not a change the characters who run the civil service have come up with in character. There is no point in trying to harangue them or to make them reverse course or make new changes, because they are the justification for this change, not the architects of it. Site changes. Due to the growing popularity of Empire, we're having to make some difficult choices about how we use the current site. These changes will affect the space allocated to tents for in-character camping, as well as vehicle access to the site before and after the event. We're going to summarise those changes along with the out-of-character reasoning for these updates. IC camping. In 2023, camp planners will only be able to guarantee sleeping space on the IC field to people with accessibility or childcare needs. Our camp planners will be asking everyone who's bringing an IC tent to the event whether it's required or optional. Required tents include all tents for role-playing in and any tents that need to be on the IC field for any accessibility reason, mobility, fatigue, childcare, etc. Optional tents include any tents that could move to an OC field if required because they're just used for sleeping or storing equipment and aren't needed for any accessibility reason. You won't be asked to justify or explain your choices. Just mark your tent as optional or required with your camp planner. If we run out of space, camp planners will move some or all of the sleeping tents labelled as optional to the new overflow fields that we've hired. The overflow fields aren't in character and don't form part of the Anvil game area, but they are adjacent to Anvil to keep walking distances to a minimum. If we only need to move a few tents, we'll ensure that we aren't moving the same tents each time. Vehicle access. You can drive into the IC area to set up if conditions allow, but you must set up quickly and then move your vehicle to the out-of-character camp as soon as you're done. On takedown, you take your tent down and have your kit ready to go before you bring your vehicle on, unless you need your vehicle for accessibility reasons during takedown. If you drive into an IC area at the start of the weekend, you must remove your car from the site as soon as you've unpacked and set up your tent. Unless you have specific accessibility requirements, you must pack up your camp at the end of the weekend before you bring your vehicle back into the IC area. Once everything is completely taken down and ready to be quickly packed away, you can bring your car onto site. Assuming that the ground conditions are reasonable, you can collect your stuff and go. After 7 p.m. on Sunday, all participants are free to drive onto site without needing to take their tents down first. We'll actively review this deadline between events and move it to earlier in the day if we're confident that we can do so without the site becoming deadlocked. All these rules apply to the IC camping areas only. There are no equivalent restrictions for vehicle movements in the out-of-character or crew camping areas. We strongly recommend bringing a plastic sheet, tarpaulin, or similar to protect your gear from any inclement weather. Please remember that if the weather gets too bad, we can't allow most vehicles onto site at all. Reasoning. We've started planning the events in 2023, and an important part of that is the need to reflect the amount of field space that we have available. We had a really successful 2022. Our numbers across the year climbed nearly 35%, and that's brilliant news. But by the end of the year, we were absolutely at the limit of what the site could cope with. Camping space was at a premium, and quite a few participants had to camp in the out-of-character areas, even if they had a suitable IC tent. During takedown, there were huge delays getting everyone on site to pack their cars because there simply wasn't room for so many vehicles to come onto site when the ground was so crowded with tents. We've now concluded our negotiations with the landowner to make enough additional space for our use next year, but there are some major challenges. In theory, we could simply assign another field to Anvil, making the IC area 50% bigger. That's not without drawbacks. Players in Dawn and Wintermark already face long walks to reach the camps at the other side of the site or to reach facilities like God, the Hall of Worlds, or the Regio. The distances everyone has to walk all weekend gets worse as the site expands. The physical site is already a challenge for any player who has mobility or fatigue issues. We don't want to make that situation worse if we've got any alternative. So after a lot of consideration, we decided to try a different approach for 2023. Before now, some IC tents in the in-character area were being used purely for sleeping or storage. Some of these absolutely need to be there, either because they're being used by groups to roleplay in, or because the occupants need to have their sleeping tent nearby for accessibility or childcare reasons. In some cases, however, the IC tent is just to have a tent nearby for convenience. While we understand everyone wants their personal tent on hand, continuing with that approach would mean that next year everyone would have to walk much further throughout the event. So in an effort to keep Anvil as accessible as we can manage, this is a new approach we'll put in place for the first event. It might be that we don't grow much next year, and we don't have to ask anyone to move their tent to the overflow area. Equally though, we might grow and find that we need to bite the bullet and expand Anvil to cover another field. We'll adapt to those circumstances as we find them. We do have problems currently with vehicles blocking camping spots on the in-character field. We can deal with this relatively easily if the owners are present or nearby and putting up their tent, but it's really difficult to deal with if the owners have simply parked and abandoned their car, especially if they haven't pre-recorded the vehicle reg number with us. Players must make sure they set up their camp as quickly as possible and then move their vehicle to the out-of-character camp so that other participants can use the space. You must not leave your vehicle overnight in the IC area under any circumstance. There is not enough room for all participants to bring their vehicles into the IC area during takedown while all the tents are still up. There simply isn't enough space for all the vehicles to pull up with so many tents everywhere, so as a result the traffic backs up and completely locks up. This led to increasingly long queues for many participants in 2022, with some players having to queue in their vehicles for up to 2 hours waiting to get onto the site. If everyone takes their tent down first, this will create enough room to let people bring their vehicles on, significantly reducing the queuing. If you need to have your vehicle present while you take down your tent for accessibility reasons, then that's fine. Otherwise, you must follow the new guidelines if you bring your car on before 7 p.m. on Sunday. At some point, enough of the site will be clear that it's fine to let vehicles come on regardless of whether they've packed down or not. We will review the 7 p.m. deadline for bringing cars on before you've packed up after each event. If we're confident that we can move the deadline earlier without causing traffic jams and delays, then we'll update the time accordingly. We know we'll have to expand Anvil at some point if Empire keeps growing. However, these 2 changes will help us delay that point as long as possible, and let us keep the physical size of Anvil to the smallest possible footprint which benefits everyone, especially the many players for whom the physical size of an IC site is a challenge already.